Right now on your phone, on your laptop, inside almost every piece of software you open, there's a small icon. A square with one corner clipped off, a thin horizontal line near the top. Millions, maybe billions, of people click this icon every single day to save their work. Most of them have never once held the physical object this icon depicts. Most of them don't even realize it depicts a physical object at all, rather than just an abstract shape. That object is a floppy disk, a device that hasn't shipped inside an ordinary computer for nearly 2 decades, and yet whose silhouette is still alive on the screen of practically every application we build, like a living fossil nobody has dared bury. But the story behind this device is stranger than the survival of its icon. The floppy disk was never supposed to be something ordinary people used in their homes. It was never supposed to enable the personal computer revolution. It was never supposed to build the software industry from the ground up. This device was built to solve a small, technical, almost embarrassingly unglamorous problem inside an IBM lab in San Jose by a team that just wanted to make a tedious internal chore cheaper. Nobody, not even the people who built it, imagined that this small, flexible object would, in under a decade, become the only way humanity sold, copied, and physically handed software from one person to another. And here's the real irony of the story. The company that invented it never fully understood what it had in its hands. IBM built a limited specialized internal tool for one narrow job buried deep inside its mainframe business. It was a different man, someone who had started this very project and then left the company, who saw the real potential of this small device and turned it into the thing an entire global personal computing industry would be built on top of. This is the story of how that happened. To understand how something this small ended up mattering this much, you have to go back to a world where storing data meant something completely different than it does today. A world where a computer's memory lived on punched cardboard, on reels of magnetic tape the size of dinner plates, or, in the case of the problem this story starts with, on nothing more portable than a technician's plane ticket. By the late 1960s, IBM was the largest computer company on Earth, an industrial giant whose mainframe computers formed the backbone of banks, insurance companies, airlines, and governments. One of the company's flagship products was the 3330 disk storage system, a device with the internal code name Merlin, built to control an enormous volume of mainframe data. But like any complex controller, this system needed a small internal program to even know how to operate, a set of low-level instructions called microcode. And that's where a simple, but expensive, problem was quietly hiding. Every time this microcode needed an update, or every time a freshly manufactured unit needed its initial programming, IBM had to either ship bulky stacks of punched cards, sometimes thousands of cards for a single update, or fly engineers with heavy equipment across the country to whichever customer happened to own a 3330. Picture it: hundreds of banks, hundreds of insurance companies, each with one or more mainframes, each needing periodic updates, and the only way to deliver that update was either a heavy box of cardboard cards or a plane ticket for a technician. It was slow, it was expensive, and it was error-prone. A single misplaced card in a stack of 1,000 could ruin the entire update. From the perspective of a senior IBM executive, this kind of problem would never make the cover of a technology magazine. No customer ever called and said, "Please invent a floppy disk for me." This was exactly the kind of problem that hides in the background of every large company, not a crisis, not a headline, just a recurring cost that quietly ate a little more out of the budget every year. Engineers responsible for maintaining 3330 units across the country spent weeks of their time on something with zero creative value, assembling boxes of cards, double-checking the correct order of the sheets, or sitting on an airplane with a suitcase full of equipment to fly to another city and do something that, in theory, should have taken minutes. This is exactly the kind of problem nobody takes seriously until somebody finally solves it and everyone else asks why it took so long. IBM's direct access storage product manager, a man named Shugart, saw this problem and decided to fix it, not with a large, loud project, but by handing it to a small, nearly anonymous team tucked into a corner of the San Jose lab. Shugart would later become one of the most influential figures in the history of the data storage industry. But in those years, he was simply a product manager with a long list of technical annoyances nobody had time to solve. Rather than diving into the engineering details himself, his real talent was finding the right person for each problem. In 1967, he handed the assignment to an engineer named David L. Noble. Find a cheap, reliable, portable way to load microcode. Nothing more, nothing less. Noble was an experienced IBM engineer who knew how to organize a small team around a fuzzy problem, even when nobody knew exactly what the final solution would look like. He started his team not with a detailed blueprint, but with a long list of existing storage media, asking them to test whether any of it could actually do the job. Nobody in that small room imagined they were building something that would one day transform the entire personal computer industry. Noble and his small team began by going through a long list of available options and rejected them one by one. First, they tried tape cartridges, the same technology used for music and audio. But tape wasn't suited to random access. You had to wind from the beginning all the way to the point you needed, which was completely impractical for a diagnostic system that needed to respond quickly. Next, they tried RCA 45 RPM phonograph records, the same records sitting in every American living room. The idea was appealing, a cheap, mass-produced medium already available on the market. But vinyl records weren't designed for precise digital data storage, and their stability and accuracy problems made them useless for this application. After that, they turned to dictation belts, the kind used in office dictating machines. Another dead end. Even a German company called Telefunken had designed a grooved magnetic disc that the team tested as well. Once again, none of these options combined the exact mix of speed, reliability, low cost, and portability that Noble was looking for. None of these experiments were easy. Every option looked promising on paper until it actually hit the test bench, and the team discovered some fundamental physical limitation standing in the way. Vinyl records, played back repeatedly under needle, wore down and lost signal quality, acceptable to a human ear listening to a song, but completely unacceptable for data that needed to be read back exactly as it had been stored. Tape cartridges stretched slightly with every winding, throwing off the timing of the data. Dictation belts were designed for the human voice, not precise digital bits. Each of these failures took weeks for Noble's small team to work through before they understood the path was a dead end, and then they had to start over from scratch. But every failure gave the team new information. They knew exactly what didn't work and why. And gradually, the picture of a completely new solution began to take shape in their minds. Instead of using an existing medium designed for some other purpose, why not build one themselves, something designed for exactly this job and only this job? There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from this stage of engineering, not the dramatic kind, but the slow, grinding kind, where a team keeps circling back to the same whiteboard, crossing out another option, and starting again. Noble's engineers weren't chasing a single flash of insight. They were working through a checklist of everything the industry already knew how to build, testing each one against the brutal, unglamorous requirements of a mainframe field technician. It had to survive being shipped in a briefcase, handled by someone in a hurry, stored in a supply closet for months, and still read back exactly the same bits it had been given the first time. Almost nothing built for any other purpose could survive that combination of demands. Which meant, eventually, that nothing off the shelf was ever going to be the answer. The solution Noble's team eventually landed on seemed, at first glance, almost simple. A thin, flexible mylar disc coated with a magnetic layer, much like the tape used in a cassette recorder, but cut into a flat circle that could spin freely, allowing a magnetic head to reach any point on its surface directly without winding from the start. They called it a memory disk. Warren L. Dalziel, the lead engineer behind the drive mechanism, played a critical role in turning this idea into a real, manufacturable, reliable device. But a bare, unprotected disk had its own problem. one that very nearly derailed the entire project. The earliest disks, when placed in the drive without any protection, were extremely vulnerable to dust, fingerprints, and contamination. Even a tiny speck of dust on the magnetic surface could cause a read error, exactly the failure this whole project had been built to eliminate. A storage device that occasionally read data incorrectly was, in practice, less reliable than a box of punched cards. This is the kind of problem that's easy to overlook in a lab, but shows up everywhere in the real world. A technician with slightly oily or sweaty fingers pulls the disk out of its box. A speck of dust from the floor of a server room, where the air is never perfectly clean, settles on the surface. A tiny scratch from bumping against the edge of a desk. Each of these, on its own, seemed trivial, but for a product meant to be handled by thousands of people, in thousands of offices, passed from hand to hand, these small failures quickly added up into a systemic reliability problem. If Noble's team couldn't solve this, the whole concept of a flexible disk, however elegant it looked on paper, would remain practically unusable for everyday work, and the project would land right back on the exact problem it was trying to escape: low reliability. The final solution came from two other engineers on the team, Ralph Flores and Herbert Thompson, and it was exactly the kind of simple ingenuity that turned this project from a fragile experiment into a real product. They designed a protective jacket that the disk would always spin inside of, never fully exposed. But here was the clever part. Inside that jacket, a non-woven fabric liner was built in, and every time the disk spun, it gently wiped its own surface clean, a self-cleaning system that removed contamination during use, instead of letting it accumulate. This seemingly small idea was the difference between a fragile lab curiosity and something you could confidently use in a bank's cold storage room or under the hands of an exhausted field technician. With that solved, the project finally found its footing. In 1969, an early version, codenamed Minnow, was added to IBM System 370 as an internal diagnostic tool. In 1970, the project was renamed IGA, and Noble's originally small team grew to more than 25 engineers, a clear sign that this was no longer a side experiment, but something company leadership had started taking seriously. Even in this limited form, Minnow was already a clear internal success. By 1971, the device had become a standard part of the System 370 and a few other products. Field engineers no longer needed to haul hundreds of punch cards or wait for the next flight. Now a small, lightweight disk fit right in their jacket pocket. From IBM's internal point of view, the project was exactly what it was meant to be, an effective fix for a small logistics problem. Nobody in IBM's management meetings was talking about a personal computer revolution. They were talking about reduced travel costs and fewer installation errors. And by that measure, the project succeeded, was closed out, and everyone moved on to the next assignment. In 1971, IBM finally brought this product to market officially, this time under the name 23FD Minnow. An 8-inch disk, with a capacity of 80 kilobytes, roughly equivalent to 3,000 punched cards, an impressive achievement for its time, but almost comically small by today's standards. A single digital photo today, on its own, would take up several times that capacity. One important detail about this early version: it was read-only. The user couldn't write anything to it or make any changes. They could only read data that had already been loaded onto it. This limitation was entirely deliberate, because the whole point of the project, from the very beginning, had been distributing ready-made microcode to 3330 controllers, not creating an all-purpose medium for everyday storage. IBM had built exactly what it had been asked to build. Nothing more. But that very deliberate limitation was exactly the point where somebody else, not at IBM, but at a rival company, saw a much bigger opportunity. This is where the strange part of the story begins. Alan Shugart, the very product manager who had assigned this project to David Noble back in 1967, the man whose original idea started it all, left IBM in 1969. He left the company even before the floppy disk was commercially released and joined a different company called Memorex. And there Shugart did something IBM never did. He and his new team built a version of the floppy disk that, alongside reading, could also write. In 1972, Shugart's team at Memorex released the Memorex 650, the world's first read-write floppy disk drive. Suddenly, the very device IBM had designed for one narrow internal task became something a user could store any data on, erase, and rewrite, exactly the capability that turned the floppy disk from a specialized mainframe accessory into a general-purpose medium. But Shugart didn't stop there either. In 1973, he founded his own company, Shugart Associates, and within a few years turned it into the largest manufacturer of 8-inch drives in the world. The man who had started this technology in a small IBM room was now, on his own, building an entire industry that IBM no longer had any control over. The 8-inch disk, revolutionary as it was compared to punched cards or magnetic tape, was still too large and too expensive for an emerging market, small personal desktop computers. Shugart Associates saw this, and in 1976 introduced a disk roughly half the size, the 5.25-inch format known as the minifloppy. This miniaturization was the moment the floppy disk stepped out of the world of corporate mainframes and into ordinary people's homes. The emerging personal computers of the late 1970s and early 1980s, devices just beginning to take shape, all searching for a cheap, portable way to store and distribute software, embraced this new format wholeheartedly. By 1978, more than 10 different manufacturers were building 5.25-inch drives, a competition that drove prices down and put the technology within reach of anyone buying a home computer. Think about it, companies like Apple, with their Apple II machines and later Commodore and Radio Shack, were all looking for a cheap way to let their users buy software, install it, and reuse it without having to retype an entire program from scratch every time. Before this smaller format, many of the earliest home computers relied on ordinary cassette tape for storage, the same tapes used for music, except that loading a program meant waiting several minutes while the tape's distinctive screeching sound loaded the data, often failing partway through and forcing you to start over. The 5.25-inch floppy disk, by comparison, was nearly instant. That simple difference in speed and reliability was enough to make this format the undisputed standard of the emerging personal computer industry. Before the floppy disk, distributing software was a logistical nightmare. You either had to move a program on enormous, expensive reels of magnetic tape, or in the truly early days, the user had to physically rewire their computer just to get a program to run correctly. None of that was compatible with a consumer software industry, one where millions of ordinary people buy, install, and share programs. The floppy disk completely rewrote that equation. Now, a software company could copy its program onto a small, light, cheap disk, put it in a cardboard box on a store shelf, or mail it directly to a customer. Users could lend disks to each other, copy them, gift them to friends. This was exactly the logistical infrastructure the personal computer industry, from Apple and Commodore to later, the IBM PC, needed in order to grow. Without a cheap, reliable way to physically move software from manufacturer to consumer, the entire home software industry, as we know it, simply couldn't have taken shape. Software stores, which today have become entirely digital and invisible, were back then literally shelves full of small cardboard boxes, each containing a floppy disk. Computer magazines of the era would sometimes even glue an entire floppy disk directly onto their cover, so a reader could install a game or a small program straight from the magazine cover. This level of access and distribution, without a cheap, lightweight and copyable medium, was simply impossible. The software industry, in this sense, didn't exist before the floppy disk, not because nobody had the idea, but because there was no way to get that idea into the hands of millions of ordinary people. In other words, the personal computer revolution is famous as a hardware revolution, microprocessors, screens, keyboards, but without a tedious, entirely unglamorous solution to the question of how do we get a program from the factory to someone's living room. None of that hardware would have been useful. And that solution was a device that, at first, was only ever meant to carry microcode to a mainframe disk controller. Through the 1980s, the floppy disk kept getting smaller and sturdier. Sony introduced the 3.5-inch format, this time with a rigid plastic shell instead of the earlier soft jacket, making the disk far more resistant to bending or physical damage. With a final capacity of 1.44 megabytes, this format became the global industry standard, and for nearly 2 decades, found its way into practically every personal computer built anywhere in the world. Kids who grew up in the 1980s and 90s saved their homework, their games, and their first ever written programs on these small, square disks. But like every technology, the floppy disk eventually gave way to something better: CDs, then flash memory, then cloud storage. Storage that once made 1.44 megabytes feel like a major achievement quickly looked tiny next to CDs offering hundreds of times more capacity, and later USB flash drives offering thousands of times more. By the early 2000s, major computer manufacturers were removing floppy drives from new machines one by one. By 2007, almost no new computer shipped with a built-in floppy drive, and the generation that came after never once had to wait for a floppy disk, with its distinctive screeching sound, to load anything at all. This is where the story takes a strange turn. Even as the floppy disk vanished from store shelves and new computers, it survived far longer in some of the world's most sensitive systems. One of the strangest examples, the United States military's Strategic Automated Command and Control System, the system responsible for coordinating nuclear forces, from intercontinental ballistic missiles to nuclear bombers and aerial refueling tankers, was still running on 8-inch floppy disks and a 1970s-era IBM computer as late as 2019. This fact was first revealed publicly in 2014 on an American television news program, sparking widespread astonishment that one of the most sensitive military systems in the world was still running on technology that had been retired everywhere else for generations. A military official later explained it simply: the system was so old that it had no internet address at all, and that was precisely why no hacker could remotely breach it. Its age, rather than being a weakness, had turned into a strange kind of security advantage. Even so, an official government report in 2016 warned that such legacy systems, however reliably they still worked, were becoming increasingly unmaintainable. Spare parts were no longer being manufactured, and the engineers who understood the technology were retiring. Finally, only in the summer of that same year, the system was at last upgraded to a modern digital storage solution, and the chapter of floppy disks in America's nuclear command finally closed after nearly 5 decades of uninterrupted service. And all the while, that small icon, the square with the clipped corner that still appears on the Save button of nearly every piece of software, has stayed alive. Generations who have never once touched a real floppy disk click on an image of one every single day without knowing what it is they're actually clicking. The device itself no longer exists, but the visual language it gave the digital world, the icon for saving, the very idea that your work should be kept on a disk, is something we still use every day. If you had to summarize this story in one sentence: a small team in San Jose who just wanted to cut the cost of shipping microcode to mainframe disk controllers, unintentionally built a device that would later become the infrastructure of the entire global software industry. They were after a cheap, reliable engineering solution to one very specific problem, not a consumer product for millions of people. But that exact design, flexible, portable, cheap, copyable, turned out to be precisely what a newly emerging world of personal computers needed. And the great irony is that IBM itself never fully grasped what it had built. They made a version that could only read, because that was all they needed. It was the man who had started the project and then left the company, Alan Shugart, who saw the missing half, a version that could also write. And that missing half was exactly what turned a specialized internal mainframe tool into something millions of ordinary people, in their homes, with no technical training at all, used every single day. This pattern, if you look closely, repeats across many of the greatest inventions in industrial history: an engineering solution to a small, specific problem that, once it lands in the hands of someone else who sees a bigger potential in it, becomes something entirely different and vastly bigger than the original creator ever imagined. The floppy disk was built to solve the problem of a disk controller. But in the end, it became the way humanity, for 2 decades, gave, sold, and shared software with one another. Think about the small workshop where David Noble and his team tinkered with dictation belts and vinyl records. With no idea they were building the foundation an entire global home software industry would one day stand on. Think about Ralph Flores and Herbert Thompson, who just wanted to solve a simple dust contamination problem, and whose solution, a simple self-cleaning jacket, turned out to be exactly what turned this fragile experiment into a product that could be manufactured millions of times over. And think about Alan Shugart, the man who started the project, left the company, and then, from the outside, saw exactly what the original creators had missed. None of these people thought, in 1967, that they were making history. They were simply solving a small, tedious problem once and for all, as well as they knew how. And that's what makes this story more interesting than almost anything else about it. The biggest technological revolutions, very often, don't start with anyone setting out to start a revolution at all. They start in a small room, with a long list of failed solutions, and one engineer just trying to do their job right. And its icon, even today, is still alive on the screen of every computer you open, a small souvenir of a room in San Jose that nobody, back then, could have imagined.